So the highly anticipated sequel to Path of Exile is now available to everyone via its early access, and it has quickly climbed to the top of the Steam charts as players both new and old rush to try what will likely be the next big ARPG. However, while PoE veterans will be entering the game fairly prepared, newcomers may find some aspects a bit overwhelming. So here are a handful of tips that will hopefully help you on your journey as a fresh exile. The first and honestly most important thing you need to understand when going into Path of Exile 2 is gear, as your armor and weapons will be the biggest way you improve your damage and survivability. However, as a new player, it can be a bit difficult to distinguish what's good and bad, as there are so many different stats and modifiers. It can feel a bit overwhelming. But in truth, it's actually quite simple to tell if an item is good or not. This is because there are a handful of stats that you're always going to want, and any item with those stats is always worth considering. For armor and accessories, the stats you'll always want to look for are increased life, any elemental resistance, and, specifically for boots, movement speed. And the reason that these stats are so important is because they significantly improve your survivability. Weapons are a bit more complicated, as the things you want can vary depending on your build. However, for non-casters, the most important factor is usually weapon damage, as it's normally the best way to increase your power. For casters, you may want to focus on the spell that the weapon provides, as well as stats like increased spell damage and/or increased elemental damage for whatever element your caster is focused on. Now, let's quickly cover the 3 different types of gear, each of which are tied to one of the main attributes, with armor linked to strength, evasion to dexterity, and energy shield to intelligence. Because of this, when you're looking for gear, you usually want to aim for items that match your main stat. Not only because the stat requirements for gear will grow as you progress through the game, but also because each defensive stat performs best when you have it in abundance. That said, stats will almost always have a higher priority, meaning that it's better to have a great piece of evasion gear on your strength build than a mediocre piece of armor. And the last thing you want to be on the lookout for is gear with sockets. These items allow you to place various runes into them for extra stats, such as elemental resistances, making them great for rounding out your defenses. But now that we've explained what you need to be looking for, let's talk about how you actually go about getting gear. Generally speaking, there are 3 different ways you'll obtain gear. The first is by going through the different areas and killing enemies, which will occasionally drop random items. This is the most common way you'll come across gear, however, you have very little control over what you get. This means if you're looking to upgrade a specific item, you'll just have to hope that the right type drops. A second and more reliable way to obtain gear is by purchasing it from the vendors found in town. Unlike random drops, you can always find gear for every slot and type from the vendors, meaning you'll almost always have access to the gear you want. However, unlike enemy drops, this isn't an unlimited supply, as the shops won't update their stock until you level, meaning if you don't get any upgrades, you'll have to wait until your next level to come back and check for new items. The last way to get gear is by crafting. Occasionally while killing enemies, instead of dropping gear, they'll drop currency items. These are used to modify various aspects of gear, such as adding stats or upgrading its rarity. For example, if you find a white item with no stats, you can use an Orb of Transmutation to upgrade it to a magic item, adding a random stat. You can then use an augmentation to add another random stat, and so on with the other currencies. However, as a new player, this is likely the most confusing way to obtain gear, plus you generally don't want to waste some of the more valuable currencies until you reach the later parts of the game and have a better idea of what you're doing. That being said, transmutation and augmentation orbs are both very common, so you don't really need to worry about using them. That being said, the best time to use currencies is when you have an item that is already good. For example, if you find a blue item with a good life roll as its only stat, then you should use an augmentation on it to see if it gets another good stat and maybe become an upgrade. Moving on to our next tip, let's quickly discuss all the different features that can be found in town. As we mentioned in the previous tip, several merchants can be found in the main town of every act, and each one serves a different purpose. One offers accessories, flasks, trinkets, casting weapons, and the disenchant function, which allows you to turn items into their corresponding crafting currency. Another allows you to gamble for items, and the final merchant sells armor and weapons for all types except staves and wands. Outside the merchants, you also have things like the hooded one, who will identify all your items and allow you to respec. The salvage bench lets you convert your gear with sockets and quality into their corresponding currency. The reforging bench allows you to turn 3 items of the exact same type and rarity into a new version of the item. The whale refills your flasks. And finally, the stash is where you can store all your items. This is shared between your characters, so if you put something in your stash on one character, you can take it out on another, making it perfect for gearing future builds you may want to play. By default, the number of stash tabs you'll have access to is extremely limited, and the only way to get more is by buying them with premium currency. If you're playing the early access, then you will already have an amount equal to what you paid for the early access. But while not as vital in Path 2, I do recommend picking up at least a few stash tabs, as they'll make your life significantly easier. Specifically, I'd recommend the currency tab and a couple premium stash tabs, which are just better versions of the normal stash tab, but you can actually name them and use them to sell items to other players. However, that function isn't going to be as important as a new player. Also, if you plan on picking up some stash tabs, it's usually best to wait for a sale, which happens basically every week. However, with that, we're done with the town, so let's move on to our next tip and talk about possibly the most intimidating part of Path of Exile 2, its skill tree. Like in the first game, the first time you level up, you were immediately met with this massive skill tree, which has turned more than a few players off the first game, due to just how overwhelming it can feel when you first see it. But like with many things, it looks harder to understand than it actually is. In truth, even as a new player with zero experience, it isn't that difficult to shape your own semi-decent build. And while it may not stack up to those crafted by the PoE veterans, it will usually at least see you through the main game. And all you have to do is keep it simple and go for the things that match what you're doing. For example, when I started my ranger, I decided I wanted to focus on poison damage. So when it came time to level up, I simply searched the term poison and looked for all the nodes near me that dealt with poison. I then started making my way to each one, picking up everything that wasn't poison chance, since my abilities already had a guaranteed chance of inflicting it. Now, I didn't just go for poison, as anytime I started to feel I was taking too much damage, I pivoted away from my damage to focus a bit more on my defenses, replacing that poison search with evasion, my main defensive type. After that, I looked for the nodes closest to where I'd already put points, and luckily there were some rather decent ones that were easily accessible. Altogether, this build has served me incredibly well, despite the fact it's likely not the most optimal thing in the world, and the main reason is I focused on one thing for my damage and didn't neglect my defenses. It's also important to note that there is no shame in following someone else's build. In fact, as the game grows and gets more complex, you'll likely see more and more people following builds rather than making their own. As for where you should go to find different builds, there are three main locations: the official forums, Mobalytics, and Maxroll. As a new player, I would personally recommend checking out Maxroll, as they offer the most beginner-friendly builds of the three. More often than not, they provide in-depth leveling guides showing you step by step what you should be doing throughout the acts. But with that, we move on to our fourth tip, which is all about abilities. You see, while your gear and skill tree are the main ways you'll increase your power, they aren't the only factors in doing damage, as you also have to properly utilize said power, and that is where your abilities come into play. In Path of Exile 2, many if not most of the abilities currently in the game often work in tandem with one another, gaining extra effects or bonus power. For example, let's take a look at fragmentation rounds. By itself, it's an okay damage option, essentially working as a shotgun that shoots several weak projectiles while knocking back enemies. However, the true power of this skill comes when it's used against a frozen target, as the attack will consume the freeze effect to deal massive damage and cause them to explode in an AoE. Now the thing is, fragmentation rounds can't inflict freeze, and if you want to take advantage of the skill's full power, you have to combo it with a skill like permafrost bolts. This ability is very similar to fragmentation rounds, except it deals less damage, but its damage type is cold, meaning it can freeze. So if you want to get the most out of these attacks, you'd want to use permafrost bolts as your main spam skill, and when the enemy is frozen, you use fragmentation rounds for a massive burst of damage. And this dynamic applies to countless other abilities in the game. Now, skills aren't the only thing to be concerned with when it comes to your abilities, as there's also support gems that increase the power or add effects to your skills. Just like comboing abilities together, using the correct support gems is another key aspect of maximizing your damage. In some cases, the right support can significantly improve the power of a skill. For example, Frostbolt plus Cold Snap is already a pretty decent combo where you use Cold Snap to explode the Frostbolts to deal good damage and freeze buildup. However, by using Scattershot on Frostbolt and Unleash on Cold Snap, you're able to vastly improve the power of this combo by increasing the number of Frostbolts you send out and the number of Cold Snaps you use per cast. It's also important to note that the support abilities shown when you use an uncut support gem aren't the only ones available. They're just the ones the devs recommend using with the different skills, and often they are strong options. However, by unchecking the recommended gems option, or simply going to the All Gems tab, you can see all the support abilities you can potentially use, though not every support works with every skill. For example, you can't use a support gem that affects projectiles on a skill with no projectiles. It's also important to know that you can't use the same support gem twice, and while supports don't have a level requirement, the number you can use is determined by how many of each main stat you have, with every 5 points allowing you to use one more support gem of the corresponding color. For example, if you had 10 strength and 5 dexterity, you'd be able to use a total of 3 support gems, 2 red for your strength, and 1 green for your dexterity. The next type of ability we need to talk about is persistent skills. Unlike normal abilities that you actively use, these are skills that serve as passive buffs. Instead of using mana or even life, they reserve spirit, a resource that by default you'll have none of. However, by completing specific optional objectives found throughout the acts, you'll not only gain permanent spirit upgrades, but you'll also receive uncut spirit gems. Now, like with skill and support gems, while the game will recommend certain persistent skills based on what your starting class is, you aren't limited to those recommendations. It's also important to know that these passives will not be active by default, and you will have to go into the skill menu and manually activate them. This is done by right-clicking the skill. Finally, we need to talk about weapon sets. When you open the skill menu, you're able to hit this arrow next to any skill to get more information about that ability. At the bottom of this menu, you'll notice that there are two checkboxes for weapon set 1 and weapon set 2. By default, these boxes will both be checked, meaning that whenever you use this ability, it will cast it with the weapon that you're currently equipped with. However, by checking only a single box, the ability will then automatically switch to the weapon corresponding to the checked box when you use that ability, but it doesn't stop there. If you go back to the skill tree, you're actually able to use the bonus skill points gained from quests and optional objectives to split your points so that they correspond to the different weapon sets. This is done by hitting the small arrow next to the weapon sets in the skill tree. This function allows you to allocate your points to better synergize with the weapons and skills you're using without having to actually spend double the points. But with that, we've covered all the major tips, so let's now move on to some smaller rapid fire ones. Like in most games, one of the first things you should do when starting is take a quick look at the settings, as there are often a handful of quality of life options you may want to adjust. Personally, I would recommend enabling the Always Show Sockets option and adjust the map zone and transparency to fit your personal preferences. While traveling through the various acts and zones, if you ever find that you need to backtrack, head to your nearest checkpoint. Interacting with it will open a menu that allows you to fast travel to any other checkpoint you've discovered, allowing you to get around the map much quicker. If you open the world map, you'll notice various different symbols. Each one of these corresponds to an event that you can find in that area. And if you ever see one with a plus, that means that it has a permanent upgrade for your character, like passive stats or skill points. If you want to disable global chat, simply press enter to access the chat, then click global to either enable or disable it. When hovering over skills and items, you'll often see certain terms underlined. If you hold Alt and mouse over these terms, you'll receive a small explanation of what they mean. Also, if you click on the underlined word, it will pin it to your UI, allowing you to move it around freely. You can also then use Alt on the words found in that explanation for even more detail. Furthermore, if you press Alt again, it will close all pinned windows. Similar to Alt, you can also hold Shift when hovering over gear to compare it to what you already have equipped. You can also alt-click any merchant to automatically open their shop window, or for the hooded one, the respec menu. If you control-click them, you'll automatically open their secondary menu, such as the disenchant screen, or for the hooded one, it will automatically identify all your items. When fighting bosses, always listen out for this specific sound. When this plays, it almost always indicates that a boss is about to do an attack that will do heavy damage if not dodged. Speaking of which, not every attack can be dodged by rolling. Some attacks require you to keep moving to avoid them. These are usually attacks that either chase you or have large indicators you need to escape before they explode. Finally, I'd personally recommend avoiding melee-based exiles like Monk or Warrior for your first character, as they're generally more difficult to play, especially without experience. However, with that, I've officially shared all the tips I have for new players. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking it and possibly subscribing to the channel. Also, if you have any other tips you'd like to offer that I didn't mention, or if you want to just share your experience with the early access, please share them in the comments. With that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.